Some people collect coins or stamps. Ian collects stories. He's one of those guys who has been everywhere, done everything, and somehow lived to talk about it. When I met Ian, he was in his 50s, built like an old dock piling, solid, dependable, weathered by life at sea. For decades, he worked maritime infrastructure jobs for both private contractors and government agencies. When something broke on the water, docks, piers, lighthouses, you called Ian. And that's how he ended up alone in one of the eeriest places he'd ever seen. A government job with no backstory. In 2013, Ian was given what sounded like a straightforward assignment: assess an old, decommissioned lighthouse for possible renovation. It had been shuttered for decades, its ownership disputed between state and federal agencies. But now someone wanted to know if it was worth restoring or demolishing. The catch? There were no recent records, no history of previous repairs, no logs of who had worked there, nothing. And the lighthouse itself was isolated, sitting on a rocky island more than 20 miles offshore. Still, Ian was excited. He loved this kind of job: remote, quiet, methodical work. He packed gear for a 3-day stay: food, water, a marine radio, and basic safety tools. The boat dropped him off, promising to return in 72 hours. Then it was just Ian and the lighthouse. First impressions. The place was weird. That's the only way Ian could describe it. It wasn't vandalized or falling apart the way abandoned places usually are. In fact, everything felt preserved, almost like someone still lived there, just out of sight. Dust on the floor, sure, but no broken glass, no graffiti, no signs of animals. Just silence, broken only by the ocean. The first day went fine. Ian mapped out structural weaknesses, checked for rot, inspected old fuel lines, and noted that the spiral staircase leading to the beacon room was still intact. The actual light mechanism was long gone, but the room had a panoramic view of endless ocean. It would have been beautiful if it didn't feel so wrong. That night, Ian ate dinner on the ground floor, radioed his progress to dispatch, and tried to sleep. Footsteps. Sometime after midnight, he woke up. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling through the old metal vent. Then he heard it clearly. Footsteps above him. Slow, deliberate human footsteps on the floor directly overhead. Ian froze. He was the only one on the island. His boat was gone. His radio was downstairs. And those steps were moving, toward the stairs. He grabbed a flashlight and a pry bar, then quietly climbed up. The spiral staircase groaned under his weight. The upper floor was empty. He checked every room, every closet, even behind the old generator panels. Nothing. And then, the sound started again. Only this time it was coming from below. He never went back to bed that night. Stranger things. The next morning he doubled down on his work, determined to finish early. But as he climbed toward the lantern room, something stopped him cold. On one wall, lined up in a neat little row, were a dozen black and white photographs he hadn't noticed before. Each photo was mounted under cracked glass and showed men standing proudly in front of the same lighthouse, but dressed in uniforms from decades past. The strange part? Ian swore those photos weren't there yesterday. That night, he didn't even bother trying to sleep upstairs. He set up in the base of the tower, keeping the radio and a flashlight within reach. Around 1:30 a.m., the sound returned. This time, 3 hard knocks on the interior wall of the tower, like someone pounding with their fist. Ian shouted, "Who's there?" But heard only silence, then footsteps again, circling him from the floor above. At that point, he made up his mind. He was leaving the next day. Contract be damned. The extraction Ian radioed the next morning, claiming equipment failure to justify an early pickup. When the crew arrived, they noticed his pale face and tense posture. "You okay?" one of them asked. "Fine," Ian lied. He didn't tell them about the footsteps, or the knocks, or the photos that appeared overnight. He just wanted off that rock. Once home, he tried to research the lighthouse's history. Ownership records, accidents, keeper's logs, but came up empty. The place had almost no public record, like it had been erased from history. Even local historians didn't have much information, other than vague stories of disappearances during its operational days. Ian's final take: Ian is not a superstitious guy. He doesn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything paranormal. Yet every time he tells this story, he shakes his head and mutters, "Something was wrong with that place. Wrong in a way I can't explain. It felt like the building itself didn't want me there." He hasn't taken a job in an abandoned lighthouse since. My cousin Nate has been in the Coast Guard for over a decade. He's the kind of guy who keeps his head down, does his job, and doesn't scare easily. Nate isn't the type to exaggerate, and he sure as hell doesn't make up ghost stories. That's why what he told me about Matinicus Rock still sends chills down my spine. A lonely lighthouse on the edge of the world. Matinicus Rock is nothing more than a jagged spit of stone in the North Atlantic, miles from the mainland, reachable only by boat or helicopter. There's no power grid, no cell signal, no neighbors. Just the roar of the ocean and an old lighthouse clinging to the edge of the rocks like a stubborn tooth. It's one of those places where you can feel how tiny you are compared to the sea. In November 2022, Nate and another Coast Guard tech named Russell were sent there on a routine 2-day job. The plan was simple: check the structural integrity of the tower, do maintenance on the beacon, and be back home before the weekend. But from the moment they landed, things felt wrong. An unlocked door and a light that shouldn't be on the main beacon hadn't been active in months. It was supposed to be completely shut down except for emergency power. But as their boat approached, Nate noticed the light was on, casting a weak yellowish beam through the fog. Worse, the door to the lantern room was unlocked. That's a huge deal. Coast Guard protocol is strict. Unmanned lighthouses must be secured. No exceptions. Russell pushed the door open and it creaked like something out of a horror movie. Inside, it was freezing. Their breath fogged in the air as they stepped in. The equipment was untouched, no signs of vandalism or intrusion. Yet Nate couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently, like they had just missed whoever it was by minutes. Then he checked the system log. At 2:12 a.m., barely 24 hours earlier, an automated distress call had gone out from the lighthouse's satellite phone. It wasn't just any call either. It listed Nate's ID as the one who placed it. But at 2:12 a.m., Nate was still at his station, miles away. And the satellite phone? It was mounted to the wall, dusty, and clearly hadn't been touched in ages. The first night, by nightfall, the wind had picked up, moaning through the cracks in the old building. Waves slammed into the rocks with a force that made the whole tower hum. Nate and Russell set up in the crew quarters at the base of the lighthouse, sleeping bags on cots, just trying to make it through the night. Somewhere after midnight, Nate woke up to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing the metal stairs. At first, he thought it was Russell, until he rolled over and saw Russell already awake, eyes wide. "You hear that?" Russell whispered. The steps grew louder, closer. Someone was in the tower with them. Nate grabbed his flashlight and his multi-tool, hardly a weapon, but better than nothing, and eased the door open. The stairwell was empty. The footsteps stopped instantly. Then Russell said something that made Nate's blood run cold. "I saw him. A man standing halfway up the stairs. And then he just disappeared." They locked every door they could and stayed up until dawn. The call that shouldn't exist. The next day, Nate radioed headquarters and requested early extraction. He wasn't about to spend another night on that rock. When the support team arrived, they had a weird question. What was with the distress call? The one from 2:12 a.m. the previous day. The one Nate supposedly made. Nate told them flat out, "I didn't call anyone. We weren't even here yet." The support crew checked the system logs. Sure enough, the call was authentic, complete with a voice signature that matched Nate's. That should have been impossible. Russell refused to even talk about what he saw. He stayed silent all the way back to shore. The ghost of Matinicus Rock Nate finished that assignment and swore he would never go back to Matinicus Rock again. To this day, he won't take jobs near it. He simply says, "There's something there, and it's not us." Locals whisper that decades ago, a lighthouse keeper was swept out to sea during a violent storm while trying to secure the beacon. His body was never recovered. Since then, there have been strange reports. The light turning on by itself, distress calls with no operator, and the sound of footsteps echoing through an empty tower. Nate isn't a believer in ghosts. He's practical, grounded. That's why when he tells this story, he looks me straight in the eye and says, "I don't know what I saw, but I know what I heard. And I know I wasn't alone on that rock."